When new money enters the economy, it doesn't reach everyone at the same moment. And that sequence, that gap between who gets it first and who absorbs the cost last, is the single mechanism that explains why you can work harder every year and still fall further behind. Not harder than your parents, not harder than your neighbors, harder than yourself, harder than you worked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and the math still comes up short. The savings account that was supposed to be a fortress turns out to be a slow leak. The retirement you planned carefully enough buys roughly what you planned, minus something you can't quite name. You didn't spend it. Nobody took it. It just went somewhere. That somewhere has a name. It has a mechanism, and the mechanism was documented precisely in writing with the outcome predicted in advance, decades before most of us felt it. That's what this is about. Not the feeling of being left behind. You already know that feeling. This is about the machinery, the pipeline, the reason the money printed in Washington ends up in certain asset portfolios before it ever reaches your grocery receipt, and why, by the time it does reach your receipt, the value has already been transferred to someone else. And here is the question we're going to answer, and we're not going to answer it until we've built the complete case. Who designed this pipeline? Who knew exactly how it worked? And did anyone on record predict what would happen if we turned it on at full volume? Stay with that question, we'll come back to it. Start with something simple. You opened a bill recently, electricity, groceries, insurance, and you did the quiet math. Not dramatically, just the arithmetic of a person who pays attention. The number was higher than last year. You make roughly what you made last year, maybe a little more. The gap between those two facts is not large enough to panic over, but it's consistent. It compounds, and at some point, the compounding produces a number that feels wrong. Not catastrophic, just persistently, stubbornly wrong. In June of 2022, that arithmetic showed up in the official data. The Consumer Price Index hit 9.1% year over year, the highest reading since 1981. 4 decades. Energy prices were up more than 40%. Groceries up more than 10%. Used cars, rents, utilities. Across the board, the cost of an ordinary middle-class life had jumped in a way that wages, raises, and interest on savings accounts could not keep pace with. The official explanations came quickly. Supply chains, the war in Ukraine, corporate greed, pandemic disruptions. Each explanation had some truth in it. None of them explained the magnitude, and none of them explained the timing, why it started where it did, and why the people who felt it most acutely were not the people at the top or the bottom of the income distribution, but the people in the precise middle, the ones with savings, the ones who had done the right things. There is a more precise explanation, and it starts not with supply chains in 2022, but with a French-Irish economist in 1755. Richard Cantillon was a banker and theorist who, almost 300 years ago, worked out something that has never been successfully refuted. When new money enters an economy, he wrote, it doesn't dilute everyone's purchasing power simultaneously, the way you might imagine water rising evenly in a tank. It flows. It moves through specific channels in a specific order. The people and institutions nearest the source of the new money receive it at full value before prices have had time to adjust. They spend it, invest it, bid up assets with it. And as the money moves outward through the economy, from banks to businesses to workers to savers, prices rise at each step to reflect the new supply. By the time the money reaches the end of the pipeline, the purchasing power has already been partially transferred away. The people at the far end of the pipe receive the money at a discount they never agreed to. This is not a conspiracy. It is a description of how money physically moves through a financial system. Cantillon called it the sequence of monetary distribution. We call it today the Cantillon effect, and it is the most underexplained mechanism in American economic life. Milton Friedman didn't use Cantillon's name, but in 1962, in Capitalism and Freedom, he formalized the same mechanism in the language of modern monetary theory. The expansion of the money supply, Friedman wrote, is not a neutral event. It doesn't benefit all holders of money equally. It is, in effect, a tax levied not by legislation, not by a vote in Congress, but by the act of expanding the supply of currency against a fixed stock of goods and assets. The people who hold cash and cash equivalents, savings accounts, fixed wages, bonds, pay this tax in full. The people who hold assets that appreciate in nominal terms, real estate, equities, commodities, are partially or fully shielded from it. and in the early phase of monetary expansion often come out ahead. He was precise about this. In Free to Choose, published in 1980, he put it in one sentence that has never been improved upon. Inflation, he wrote, is the one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation, not a metaphor, a mechanism. And here is what that mechanism looks like in practice. In March of 2020, the Federal Reserve began the largest monetary expansion in American history. By the end of 2022, the M2 money supply, the broadest standard measure of money in circulation, had roughly doubled. $2 trillion became roughly $22 trillion. The Fed purchased Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities at a pace that had no modern precedent. The stated purpose was to stabilize the financial system during a pandemic. The mechanism through which that stabilization occurred is the part that rarely gets explained. New money created by the Federal Reserve enters the economy through a specific doorway: primary dealers. These are the 24 or so large financial institutions, the JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachses, the Bank of Americas, that are authorized to transact directly with the Fed. When the Fed buys a security, it credits the account of a primary dealer. The primary dealer now holds cash at full, pre-inflation value. What does a primary dealer do with cash? It deploys it into equities, into real estate, into credit markets. Between March of 2020 and January of 2022, the S&P 500 rose roughly 114% from its pandemic low. Housing prices, as measured by the Case-Shiller National Index, rose approximately 38%. Commercial real estate, private equity, venture capital, all of it moved upward in nominal terms, and in many cases in real terms, during the same period that the new money was being deployed. Now follow the pipeline to its next stage. Those asset price increases benefit the people who hold assets. According to the Federal Reserve's own distributional financial accounts, the wealthiest 20% of American households hold approximately 85% of all publicly traded equities. The bottom 50% hold essentially none. So the first effect of the monetary expansion was to enrich asset holders. The second effect, which arrived later, was to raise the prices of goods and services, which is what the Consumer Price Index measures. That 9.1% in June of 2022 arrived 12 to 18 months after the asset price surge, after the primary dealers had already deployed the new money, after the equity markets had already run, after the real estate had already repriced. The purchasing power transferred first. The grocery receipt reflected it second. Your savings account, the one earning 0.4% while inflation ran at 9%, was at the back of the pipeline. Not because of corporate greed, not because of supply chains, because of the sequence. That's the mechanism. Now here is where this becomes something more than a description of recent events. The pipeline you just watched run in 2020 through 2022 is not new. It ran before. And someone with an extraordinary record of documented predictions saw it coming. Not generally, not vaguely, but specifically with a date. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon made a decision that restructured the entire global monetary order. He closed the gold window, meaning the United States would no longer redeem dollars held by foreign governments for gold at the agreed rate of $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored global monetary policy since 1944, was over. The dollar became, for the first time in American history, a purely fiat currency, backed not by a commodity, but by the full faith and credit of the United States government. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, 1971, Milton Friedman published a column in Newsweek. He was writing about Nixon's simultaneous announcement of wage and price controls. A 90-day freeze on wages and prices meant to suppress the inflation that had already begun building in the late 1960s. Friedman was direct. The controls would not work. They could suppress prices temporarily, but they could not suppress the monetary cause of those prices. When the controls were lifted, he wrote, the suppressed inflation would emerge, with force, possibly with greater force than if the controls had never been imposed. The monetary expansion that had been building since the late 60s would have to express itself eventually. Postponing it was not eliminating it. He was correct on the timeline. The controls were imposed in phases from 1971 to 1974. When the final controls were lifted, inflation did not return to the modest levels of the early 1960s. It surged. The Consumer Price Index hit 11% in 1974. The second wave, driven by the oil shocks and continued monetary loosening, pushed it to 13% by 1979 and 14% in 1980. Median real wages, adjusted for inflation, declined over the entire decade of the 1970s. The middle class that had built the post-war American prosperity, that had saved in the currency they trusted, had the purchasing power of those savings methodically transferred away. The people who owned assets, particularly real estate, fared differently. Home prices in nominal terms kept pace with inflation and, in many markets, exceeded it. The distributional pattern of the 1970s matched the distributional pattern of Cantillon's mechanism almost exactly. Asset holders shielded, wage earners and cash savers exposed. Friedman had a name for why this was inevitable. He had written it 12 years before, in a program for monetary stability, published in 1960. Inflation, he wrote, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning it is caused by money growing faster than the output of goods and services. It is not caused by unions. It is not caused by oil shocks, which can alter relative prices but cannot sustain a general price level increase without monetary accommodation. It is not caused by corporate greed, which is presumably constant and therefore cannot explain why prices were stable for years and then surged. The cause is always, and only, the supply of money relative to the supply of goods. The 1970s proved him right with a precision that should have settled the question for a generation. It didn't. If what you just heard reorganized something for you, the mechanism, the pipeline, the question of why the people who did everything right somehow ended up absorbing a cost they never voted for, that feeling is worth something, and it points somewhere useful. There's a guide in the description called the Friedman Decoder. It takes 30 of Friedman's most precise economic arguments on inflation, on monetary policy, on taxation, on education, on the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom, and puts each one in plain English, one page, with the source and the documented outcome, not a summary of his ideas in general terms. The specific arguments made precisely in a form you can use at a dinner table, in a conversation with your kids, in a moment when someone says, "The economy is complicated," and you know it's not complicated. It's just that the mechanism hasn't been named. The link is in the description. Now, the question we planted at the beginning. Who designed the pipeline? Who knew how it worked? And did anyone predict, on record, what would happen if we turned it on at full volume? Here is the answer. The pipeline, the Federal Reserve System of primary dealers, open market operations, and monetary transmission through financial institutions, was not designed maliciously. It was designed largely as a matter of operational necessity. The Fed needs counterparties to conduct monetary policy, and primary dealers are those counterparties. The pipeline is a structural feature, not a conspiracy, but the distributional consequences of that pipeline were understood. They were documented. And they were predicted with a specificity that makes the word prediction feel inadequate. It feels more like reading a diagnosis that was written before the symptoms appeared. Here is what Milton Friedman wrote in August of 1971 about a monetary expansion that was just beginning, with wage and price controls still in place, with inflation still in the single digits, and most Americans still confident the situation was manageable. He wrote that suppressing the price signal would not suppress the underlying cause. He wrote that monetary expansion expresses itself first in asset prices, then in goods prices, with a lag that historically runs anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. He wrote that the people most exposed to this lag are those whose income is fixed in nominal terms, wage earners, pensioners, savers. And he wrote that the people least exposed are those whose wealth is held in real assets, because those assets reprice upward in the early phase of the expansion, before the consumer price index has fully reflected the new money supply. Now consider what the Federal Reserve's own data showed between March of 2020 and June of 2022. Asset prices surged first. The S&P ran. Housing repriced. The wealth of the top quintile expanded in real terms. Then, 12 to 18 months later, the CPI arrived at 9.1%. Wages, which had nominally increased, fell behind inflation for most of the period. The middle class, the people with savings accounts, with fixed pension income, with carefully accumulated retirement balances denominated in dollars, absorbed the cost that the pipeline had created. The mechanism was the same. The sequence was the same. The distributional outcome was the same. 50 years apart, predicted, in detail before the first wave arrived, predictable, and predicted. That is not hindsight. That is not partisan interpretation. That is the record, the documented record, available in a News Weekly column from August of 1971, confirmed by 4 decades of economic history, and confirmed again by the data you lived through in 2021 and 2022. If you felt like something was taken from you, quietly, without your consent, that feeling is correct. You weren't oversensitive. You weren't economically naive. The arithmetic confirms you. The mechanism explains you. And the historical record shows that the outcome was not an accident, not a crisis mismanaged, not a failure of forecasting. It was a pattern activated, played out, and documented that a 72-year-old economist described in a magazine column the same week. The mechanism was turned on at full power. The question isn't whether Friedman was right. The record settled that. The real question, the one worth sitting with, is this. If the mechanism is this well documented, if the distributional outcome has repeated itself across decades, if the prediction was this precise and this public, why does the pipeline keep being reactivated? That question doesn't have a clean answer. But it's the right question. And anyone who can ask it clearly, with the evidence behind it, is not confused about what happened to their savings. They're equipped. Tell me the one Friedman line you wish every member of Congress had to read aloud before casting a vote on monetary policy. Leave it in the comments. I read every one.